This is the third iteration of My Daddy Was There, and I just pray that this message helps to edify someone and draw them closer to God and seeing God in Black history. My daddy was there when Noah got off the boat. My daddy was there when Ham's progeny unleashed blackness to the world and gave it the beauty of Sheba, the wisdom of Jethro, and the might of Nimrod. He was there to show the world that saving people from bondage set a course for Jewish history, Christian history, African history, and history around the world. My daddy was there. My daddy was there to show that through Cyrus and Sheba, Africans have been more than servants, but standard bearers for strength, brilliance, and beauty. He was there when Jesus gathered his disciples and preached of faith, hope, and love, a message that, though interrupted and mistranslated, carried to modern descendants around the world so that we have gospel music, great preachers, soulful sounds, worship, strong prayer, and the strength to endure. My daddy is here today, making sure that if I pay attention in 100 years, in 1,000 years, our children will know Black history as world history, and even more importantly, recognize God in it. Despite a yearly commemoration of Black history during February a year ago, I was saddened by my own children. I asked them to name some famous civil rights people or just civil rights people. And yeah, of course, they knew Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. They were loosely familiar with Malcolm X, but stumbled to recall the importance of anyone else. This is a problem. This is endemic in what our kids are not learning in school. So now I dare you a year later to ask them about Huey P. Newton, Arthur Ashe, Wilma Rudolph, A. Philip Randolph. It's our parents' duty to make sure that our children are knowledgeable of the multiple colors that have contributed to the world. The truth is, what is represented and what is not the same. So when I hear that I do not see color and race, does not matter. I applaud the sentiment. However, the basis for these statements is heavily slanted, disfavoring my fellow African descendants. The purpose of this time of focus, Black History Month, is not to minimize the contributions of any other group, but to spotlight the gainful contributions that sons and daughters of Kush, Punt, Carthage, Axum, Mali, Songhai, Zimbabwe, historically great African kingdoms that our study of history ignores. We distill world's history to being only about Europe and Western Asia and ignore Sheba, Nefertiti, Shaka, Mansa Musa, Mahura, Imhotep, only making reference to them in regards to their interactions with European kings. The tapestry of history cannot be fully colored without the black crayon. So some ask, why does it even matter? Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you your elders, and they will tell you. We can learn from it. We can better understand who we are and why. Deuteronomy 32:7. That is why in some cases some have tried to change the details in history without taking time to pay attention to the details of the Bible, to the details of history. We would not know of the everlasting effect of the sons and daughters of Ham, Cush, Canaan, Put, and Mizraim. Black History Month is a time to reflect on the history, Christian history, as it pertains to Black people. Black involvement in Christianity and the church's relationship with Black people. Fortunately, it is because of Christ the history of Black people in this country is so rich. But it is also in part because of the church that Black history has its black marks. It's important to note that at every stop and every step of the way, God has been there and that our forefathers carried on. But my daddy was there, so I know better. My daddy was there. Hundreds of verses in scripture address the idea of remembrance, encouraging us to reflect upon past triumphs and tragedies and recall the God of our salvation. In chapter 4 of Joshua, God commands Joshua to set up 12 stones in remembrance of Israel's miraculous crossing of the Jordan River. The stones will stand as everlasting memorial to communicate to future generations the provisions of the Lord. They were to be faithful witness to a faithful God who understood the propensity of humans to forget. Black History Month serves us and those who come after us, much like those memorial stones did for the Israelites. It helps us remember to show honor. It helps us to remember not to repeat the poor past. It helps us to remember to inspire hope. My daddy was there when Noah got off the boat and saw an earth that had been purified. He was there when Ham ventured to the land we know now as Africa. He was there when Ham's sons birthed the nations of the world that gave us all things African. Africa is 3 times larger than the U.S., with a history that is several thousands of years old. In the previous weeks, I spotlighted some of the historically important people and kingdoms so that we can begin to extend our appreciation for its people there and around the world. We know that there were kings and queens, Mensa Musa, the richest man ever in the existence of history, and Sheba, the builders of great libraries in Alexandria, philosophers that we still draw on today, such as Tertullian and Origen. But we also know that at some point in history took a step backwards, as my daddy was there when the first African was put in bondage and put on a ship and shackled and shipped to Portugal. Then the New World of America. He was there when he was put in a strange place with a foreign language and foreign food and foreign ways. He was there when he was worked and beaten like a mule, fed scraps, and worked harshly. He was there in the creation of soul food, the genesis of gospel music, because despite the anguish of their days, the gospel was that a chariot was going to swing low to carry his people home. Many of the old Negro spiritual songs have recurring themes of yearning for freedom, the hope to be lifted out of suffering, and the belief that a higher power will help a person persevere in tough times. According to legend, the messages in some lyrics were quite literal, offering slaves specific instructions on how to travel north to freedom. One such song is "Follow the Drinking Gourd." Fugitive slaves would follow the drinking gourd, another name for the Big Dipper, northward, like the wise men found their way to Christ. My daddy was there. He was there when a misguided version of the gospel was taught. He was there to make sure that the lessons of faith, hope, and love penetrated the selfishness and the hate that motivated this evangelism. He was there during the American Revolution when Wentworth Cheswell rode west to warn the colonists that the redcoats were coming. But Paul Revere rode east and got all the shine because Cheswell didn't have the proper complexion. He was there when the revolution was over, and Harriet Tubman had to be undercover Moses, who, along with other blacks and whites, transported more than 30,000 black Americans from southern slavery to northern freedom, because though all men are created equal, slavery still reigned in the South. He was there when Gabriel Prosser, Nat Turner, and John Brown, 2 black and 1 white brother, planned the revolts to overthrow slavery. He was there with one of the first black preachers in America, who was John Morant, born a free black in New York in 1755. His father died when he was young. So in 1770, when he was 15 as a teenager during the Great Awakening revival, Morant was taken to hear evangelist George Whitefield in Charleston, South Carolina, and he came to Christ. Morant wandered away and lived in the woods, trusting God to provide. He was befriended by the Cherokee and learned their language. And as tensions grew prior to the Revolution, British inciting Indians, Morant was arrested by the Cherokee chief and almost executed. Providentially, he preached. He preached to the chief, who then converted and gave him complete permission to proclaim the gospel among the entire tribe. He also preached to the Creek, the Catawba, and the Hausa. John Morant returned to South Carolina, where he preached among the slaves. When the Revolutionary War broke out, he was impressed into the British Navy and taken to England, where he preached for years. He went from the Native Americans to the Indians. He later returned to preach the gospel of Nova Scotia to a great number of Native Americans and white people at the Greens Harbor near Newfoundland. He was there with Richard Allen. My father was there when Richard Allen, born a slave in February of 1760. Allen eventually brought his freedom and founded the first black church in America, the AME, the American Methodist Episcopal Church. When Allen was a slave, he converted to Methodist after hearing a preacher's anti-slavery sermon. Once freed, he joined St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church. When he became frustrated, though, with the church's limitations on blacks and its enforcement of racially segregated pews in the house of the Lord, Allen staged a walkout along with Reverend Absalom Jones, who later founded the Free African Society, of which the AME Church grew out of. My daddy was there when George Leal, an African-American and emancipated slave who became the first founding pastor of First Bryan Baptist Church and the first African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia. Leal became the first American missionary in 1782. The first American, not just African American. My daddy was there during the drafting of the Constitution, where 3/5 clause was declared for the purposes of representation in Congress. Enslaved blacks would be counted as 3/5 of a human. Counted for political purposes, discounted because of hate, because of a perception of power. When the U.S. participation in international slave trade ended in 1807, when the 13th Amendment freed all enslaved people in the United States, the 14th Amendment gave them full citizenship, and 15th Amendment granted black men the right to vote in the 1860s. My daddy was there. He was there in Vermont. He was there when Vermont was the first to abolish slavery in 1777 on September 22nd, 1862. He was there when Abraham Lincoln gave the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, when it went into effect. My daddy was there when over 150,000 slaves had been transported west to reenact the Middle Passage by moving them out of the reach of the Union Army. He was there on June 19th, 1865, when Union General Gordon Granger led thousands of federal troops to Galveston, Texas, to announce that the Civil War had ended Juneteenth and slaves had been freed. Approximately 250,000 Texas slaves had no idea that their freedom had been secured by the government, and slavery, as we knew it in the United States, was eradicated. Some 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. My daddy was there during the Civil War when hundreds of thousands died. And make no mistake, this was fought over the question of whether the economy was important enough to legitimize the reason for having slaves. He was there. He was there when the war was over and the country now had millions and millions of unemployed former slaves. People who owned nothing and had nothing. My daddy was there when these people sharecropped and found their ways to build communities, churches, businesses, and thrived. Just to watch governmental takedown in the Tulsa riots and the great progress made in a short time be wiped out by Reconstruction. He was there, though, when Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black man elected to the U.S. Senate in 1870. My daddy was there in the front row to witness the Harlem Renaissance from 1918 to 1937. Marcus Garvey, Zora Neale Hurston, Duke Ellington, Josephine Baker, W.E.B. Du Bois, Louis Armstrong, Langston Hughes, and the likes. Names, if you don't know, you should Google, as they were scholars, poets, musicians, entertainers, preachers, politicians, whose shoulders we stand on today in music, culture, politics, and the pulpit. My daddy was there when HBCUs were founded. Cheyney University, formerly Institute for Colored Youth, in 1837. The Ashland, now Lincoln University, in 1854. Wilberforce University, the first university privately owned and operated by African Americans. That was 1856, before slavery was over. Then, with the help of the Freedmen's Bureau, Clark and Lannon in 1865. HU, the Howard University, Morehouse College, both in 1867, along with Spelman in 1881. Originally founded as the Atlanta Baptist Female Seminary. Tuskegee Institute, founded by Booker T. Washington. Hampton, North Carolina A&T, Grambling, Southern, and the list goes on. My daddy was there when historically black frats and sororities had Greek sings, which evolved into Greek shows, the first of which was held at Howard University in 1976, giving the world a step show, paying tribute to their history. My daddy was there from Dred Scott in 1857 when the Supreme Court ruled that people of African descent that are slaves were slaves and subsequently freed, along with their descendants, cannot be citizens. Consequently, they cannot sue in federal court. He was there in 1896 for Plessy versus Ferguson, where the court decided that segregated facilities for blacks and whites are constitutional under separate but equal, which was not overturned until almost 60 years later in 1954, when it was decided by Brown versus the Board of Education, where it decided that segregated schools in the states were unconstitutional because they violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. He was there in 1967 when loving was made legal, as the court ruled that laws prohibiting interracial marriage are unconstitutional. Literally, the name of the case is Loving versus Virginia. He was there when Jim Crow was the rule. Medgar Evers and Emmett Till, Yusuf Hawkins, Philando Castile, and the thousands of other wrongfully murdered for being black. He was there at 16th Street Baptist Church bombing was an act of white supremacy terrorism, which occurred at the African American 16th Street Church in Birmingham, Alabama, on September 15th, 1963. He was also there when Elijah Lovejoy was lynched for publishing an abolitionist newspaper in 1837. And when Viola Louisa was shot participating in a march on Selma and being a civil rights activist. Oh, Lovejoy and Louisa are white. Just as much as blacks are a part of American history, to my white brothers and sisters, do not feel guilty about our history, as there have been positive contributions as well. Take strength and courage and love from our forefathers. Just as we all admire Abraham Lincoln, we can all admire Frederick Douglass. Just as Babe Ruth is an American hero, so is Jesse Owens and Wilma Rudolph. My daddy was there when Jesse Owens showed speed, flight, power, and grace in the face of international tyranny, and when Joe Louis shocked the world on his way to a comeback, defeating Max Schmeling in Germany. He was there for first Jackie Robinson integrating baseball, Jack Johnson being the first black heavyweight champion. Despite the police shutting off the video camera so that the world would not see Jack knock out the former champ, Tom Burns. He was there when Matthew Henson became the first man to hit the North Pole, from Adam C.J. Walker being the first black millionaire. He was there when Tommy Smith and John Carlos gave new meaning to fist held high on the Olympic stage. And while Ali, with 2 fists, shook up the world, he was there and bobbed his head when Marvin Gaye sang the Star-Spangled Banner with rarefied soul. And then also when Whitney Houston did a conventional rendition and moved Americans to tears after 9/11. He was there when MJ moonwalked and sold 40 million across the stage, celebrating Berry Gordy's Motown 25th anniversary 38 years ago. He was there when Mrs. Parks sat on a bus, when King vocalized his dream, when we went from separate but equal to just governmentally proclaimed equal. He was there at every march, every slaughter, every sit-in, every sermon, every arrest, in response to the literal and political lynchings and strange fruits of the day. He was there at Bloody Sunday, the signing of the Voting Rights Act, the riots during the summers of the 60s. He was there during the Rodney King beatings and the verdicts and the ensuing riots. Can we all just get along? Panthers. He was there to see every president elected, including 44. He was there during the summer of 68, but he was also there during the summer of 2020. He's been here during the pandemic. He has been present And just as the old Negro spiritual themes presented, he has turned hopes into realities. He's carried us through struggles and continues to carry us. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. Proverbs 15:3. From the celebration and struggles of our history, continue to know that this is all in God's plan. And we know that in all things work together for the good of those who love them, who have been called according to his purpose. We have one more week to celebrate Black History Month. And in doing such, I hope we can reflect upon all of the tragedy, but as well all of the triumph in this history. And most specifically, that we see God in all of it and how it has worked to position us to where we are today, but knowing that this isn't the end. For there is a day coming when he will come back and take all of his children. And I pray that you, if you're not or have not chosen Christ as your Savior, you do such. And if you are, you continue to do what you're supposed to do to draw closer. Our reflection on history is done so that we can either be made, marked, or matured as his disciples. And hopefully our reflection on history can help you to move along in that path.